I just wanted to say, at the end of the lecture last week, a couple of people were asking me about recording the lecture, because obviously this room doesn't have the lecture capture facilities, and so you don't get the encore recording. I'm absolutely fine with people recording, so if you want to, feel free to. I particularly understand when English is your second language, it helps a lot to go back and listen to it again. So yes, absolutely fine. I'd suggest that if you, do you want to leave the door open just because it's so stuffy in here? I'd suggest that if somebody is recording, they offer to share with their friends because it's just more efficient that way than everybody recording separately. Okay, but yeah, feel free. I'm kind of disappointed we don't have the lecture capture things because I think they're very valuable. You shouldn't, so for your other classes, you may have, while I'm talking, can you not have a discussion? Sorry. For your other classes, you probably do have the lecture capture, right? And so you've got the encore recordings of the lectures. Use them, but don't use them as a substitute for your lectures. Use them to revise, okay? There have been quite a lot of studies now that universities are using these quite extensively, which show that people who use them instead of going to lectures don't perform nearly as well as the people who go to the lectures. Okay? You don't get the opportunity to ask questions and that sort of thing, but also you don't get the opportunity to interact with the lecturer in the same way. When I'm lecturing, I'm looking around the class, and when I see blank faces, I think I'm not explaining this very well, and I'll adapt my explanation to suit you. Or I'll ask, you ask questions and that sort of thing, and the question that somebody over there asks might be something that you hadn't thought of asking, but is actually really relevant to you, and that sort of thing. If people don't come to the lectures, we don't have those opportunities. Okay, so do make sure you go to your lectures. Right, so requirements validation. The point is that you're ensuring that the specification actually captures what the customer really wants and or needs. And those two things are not necessarily the same thing. Wants and needs have subtle differences. It depends how well the user understands the bigger picture of their workplace and that sort of thing. So checking requirements involves validity. So does the system specified actually provide the functions which best support the customer's needs? Best is a bit tricky, but it's a bit of a woolly term. Consistency. Are there any conflicts? Right? Have you said that it'll have particular performance characteristics here, and then somewhere over there you've said it will do some particular thing which is going to guarantee that it never meets those performance characteristics. Right, so just checking for things like that. Completeness, have you got everything in there? Realism, are you actually going to be able to deliver what you've got in that specification? Okay, there's no point saying that you're going to build a rocket that goes to the moon if you can't build one that goes over a mountain. And verifiability, well, this is a tricky one. Can these requirements actually be checked? Okay, so this is why you need precision in your specification, because what you want to be able to do is to have things that are essentially in some way measurable, to be able to say at the end, when you deliver the software, this was in the requirements specification, and here is where I satisfied that requirement. And you want there to be no arguments that that particular piece of evidence that you're pointing to demonstrates that that requirement has been satisfied. Okay? So, essentially, as part of the requirements engineering process, this validation step happens if it was going to be a formal contract, if your specifications were going to form a formal contract, you would do this before it was signed off. Right? If it's not going to be a formal contract, if you're doing, say, agile methods, you still have some form of requirements validation in there, particularly if you, so there, remember your requirements specification is basically going to be a set of user stories. So you're going to check that you have coverage or completeness. You're going to check that you don't have any conflicts. You're going to check that every one of these user stories is measurable in some way. You know, all these things still apply, right? But because your user stories change in the Agile process, and they get added to or modified or whatever as you're going through the development process as well, this requirements validation is an ongoing process as well. Every time your user stories change, you do the validation process. You think about not just the change to the particular story that you've got, but how it might impact upon other stories that you've got in your story set, that type of thing. Okay, and the final part of requirements engineering is dealing with change. Okay, so we've talked about before, software always changes. And partly that's because the business and technical environment of the system always changes after installation. So they get a new managerial structure in the business, for example, or they get different types of hardware that they're using. They have to interface with different systems, that sort of thing. The users who pay for a system and the users of that system are rarely the same people. And sometimes you need to make change to accommodate one set or the other. And large systems usually have a diverse user community with many users having different requirements and priorities that might be conflicting or contradictory, and your user group might change over time, which will force change upon your system. Okay? So, you know, people talk about the mobile generation, the kids who've grown up, who've used, you know, tablets and stuff from when they were toddlers and that sort of thing. And I don't think you lot quite fit into that category, but we're starting to get people in first year who do fit into that category. And they have a whole different way of interacting with technology to retirees, for example. And who knows what the next generation that comes through in 20 years' time, what they're going to be like interacting with technology. It might change things quite radically again. Okay, so requirements management is the process of managing the change in requirements. We get new requirements emerging as the system's being developed, and Agile acknowledges that quite explicitly. Some traditional software engineering processes do, and some don't. Okay? And you basically need to keep track of the requirements, and particularly the changing requirements, so that you can monitor that impact that any changes will have. And you need to record them, because if you have started with a formal requirement specification document, that document is often the basis that any engineers who are doing updates to the system will go to make changes. So if you have started with a requirement specification, and then during the development process, new requirements have emerged and you've implemented them and they've gone through into the production. This is the disturbance. That's the train of thought now. If those changes that have emerged during the implementation, the design, have gone through into production, and you haven't updated that requirement specification, 2 years down the line, the hardware infrastructure of the company changes. So they move to cloud-based systems or something like that, but they want to keep using the same software. The new engineers, and it might be a completely new team, are going to start with that requirement specification document. And they'll miss all those things that got put in along the way. So what you need to do is to have a very explicit process that pops them back in to updates the requirement specification document. Okay? With an Agile method, where you're updating user stories, it is explicitly being updated as you go along. And you keep that set of user stories, which grows and shrinks over time, but what you get at the end is the user stories that have been implemented and tested and validated and so on. Okay, so when we are changing something in terms of the requirements, we need to decide if we should actually accept the proposed change. Okay, it's not just a case of, oh, here's a new requirement, let's put it in. We need to say, okay, first of all, is it actually something that we want to put in, right? To check that it's valid, that the regulator accepts that you can do this sort of thing, that, you know, something like that. How much is it going to cost to implement this changed requirement? Okay, if we use that requirement specification as a contract at the start, and now the users have decided that they want this as well, we've got grounds for rejecting it if we think it's going to massively balloon our costs or something like that. We might say, no, we can't do it because it's just going to cost too much to accommodate that change. Or we might come back and say, well, we could accommodate it, but it would mean an increase in the cost of the contract or an increase in the time to develop the software or something like that. And would you accept that change? And this involves a contract renegotiation. Or we could just outright reject it. And we need to update the requirements document, as I said. As we should have a system in place that allows that to happen. Okay, because realistically, change does happen. Agile is based around the premise that change happens, and that's one of the benefits, big key benefits of the Agile process, but not the only one, remember? Part of it is about managing the pace of work and all that sort of thing, so there's a whole lot of other benefits. But even if you're using traditional methods, even if officially your company is using the waterfall method where you do the requirement specification, then you do the design, then you do the detailed design, and you have this trickle-down thing, even then, these days when you see the diagram, there are loopbacks up the waterfall. So people put in siphons or something, I don't know, but you have to acknowledge that things will change. Okay, so the key points that we've covered today have been functional and non-functional requirements, the process of requirements engineering as a whole, and then those 4 separate things: requirement solicitation, specification, validation, and change. So they're the key points that we've covered today. Discussion questions. So first of all, these aren't on the slides that you've got there. You've got a blank slide for this bit. Okay. This is a change of practice. I deliberately did this. I'll put them up though as soon as I go back to my office so that you can do it. But, so first one. We've got some ambiguities or omissions in the following statement of requirements for a part of a ticket issuing system. Okay, and the statement is, an automated ticket machine sells rail tickets. Users select their destination, input a credit card and a personal identification number, the rail ticket is issued and the credit card account charged. When the user presses a start button, a menu display of potential destinations is activated, along with a message to the user to select a destination and the type of ticket required. Once a destination has been selected, the ticket price is displayed and customers are asked to input their credit card. Its validity is checked and the user is then asked to input their personal identifier. When the credit transaction has been validated, the ticket is issued. Yes?
May I ask, what does ambiguity mean?
Ambiguity means where there's a statement that could be interpreted in more than one way. Good question. Very important. Okay, so What's wrong with the statement?
I may say it's not clear rather than ambiguous.
That's fine, yeah.
Yeah, because it doesn't say will it sell tickets to children, because normally they don't have an ID
They don't-
card or
They don't have a credit
account.
card, yeah?
Yeah. And they didn't give the developers a detailed description of the ticket machine, how it works, hardware. I
Yeah.
know nothing about the hardware.
Okay. What sort of things would you like to be able to do with a ticket machine like this that it doesn't cover? Okay, so this is actually quite similar to the ones you'd use down at Sheffield Station, for those who've used it. What sort of features do those machines have that this doesn't describe? Yes?
A touch screen.
Touch screen, yeah?
There's no.
Do you think it makes much difference if you have a touch screen or a keyboard type input?
Well, there's no discussion in the statement or specification about how the user will interact with the machine. So clearly that's an omission, isn't it?
It could be an omission. So I guess what I'm saying is it could be an omission, but if you could see that as a way that a user could perform these tasks either through a keyboard type interface or a touch screen, if it would be possible to do it both ways, then it might be that you're building software that would work with both of those systems.
Okay.
Maybe. Okay, so maybe if it was definitely to work with touchscreen only, you would say it that it should be in there as a non-functional requirement.
Okay.
Yep.
And it doesn't tell me how to calculate the price.
I think it did. So once the destination has been selected, the ticket price is displayed. So it will tell you the price.
But from my experience, if you, for example, if you buy online, sometimes it's cheaper.
But that's the same with the ticket machines down at the station. They have that shortcoming too. You don't get all the discounts. Yes. This is for tickets that you want to sort of buy and ride straight away without discounts. Yeah.
Maybe whether the user can use a credit card or cash. For his ticket.
Yeah, I think this one's quite explicitly credit card only, and there are machines like that at the station. Yeah. So I think it does say. It implies that it's credit card only. I don't think it says it explicitly, but yeah. Yep.
It doesn't give the user the option to obtain a receipt at the end of the transaction.
That's a good point. There's nothing about receipts, and the user it might be important for the user to get a receipt in terms of if you're claiming for expenses. Many companies will only accept an official receipt and not the ticket itself or a credit card statement. Yep. Anything else?
It doesn't tell us the date.
Sorry?
Date.
The date?
Yeah.
The date of travel, yeah, that's a good point. So there seems to be some assumption it's only for tickets for now. Okay, but that's implicit. So yeah, having some way of, it might by default sell a ticket for immediate travel, but you might want it to be able to buy a ticket in advance for travel tomorrow.
Maybe it doesn't display the different type of ticket. Some tickets for children and some tickets
Yeah,
for adults.
so it doesn't have concessionary fares mentioned there at all.
But isn't it like it says you select a destination and type of ticket required?
Oh, it does, yeah, sorry, it does. So type of ticket required, so, yeah, okay. Yes?
It didn't mention how to cancel it.
That's a very good one. So what happens if, you select your destination and with those touch screens, sometimes you accidentally select the one next to it instead of the one that you actually wanted, and you don't want to proceed with the transaction then. And I have seen badly designed ones where you just have to wait for it to time out, where there's no cancel button, right? So yeah, having an option to cancel is I think important, and it's not mentioned.
I think it's
it's not clarify how to refund the ticket.
Yeah, so an option for refunding. So what happens if you accidentally complete the transaction and it's not what you wanted? Is there some way of doing something?
It have notice, security notice when input the PIN
So the PIN number, you need some sort of security
notice.
that's, yeah, so that should, and well, you should also perhaps have something about just security in terms of the non-functional requirements of the system. So PIN numbers need to be not stored on the machine, only used for validate, you know, that type of thing. So you might have a non-functional requirement there.
It doesn't say what happens if the credit card has been rejected.
Yep, that's true. So what happens if there's a problem with that particular card? Can the user try to pay with a different card? You know, that type of thing.
And what would happen if the personal identification number is not valid?
Yep, so what happens if they put in the wrong personal identification number? Okay, do they get another try? Does it, you know, if they try too many times, do they get locked out? Yep.
In terms of the instructions, there's no option for the user to select a different language.
Yep.
Or it doesn't actually specify what language the instructions are. I mean, we're assuming it's English, but
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's this day and age, it's
Yeah.
perfectly reasonable to expect that there will be different languages available. Yeah.
If I have bought the ticket on my phone, can I use this machine to get the ticket?
I think that would be probably beyond the specification of what we're doing for this system. I think you could imagine a system that would do that, but it's not necessarily a shortcoming of this specification. Okay?
Yes, but they need to.
Yeah, I know what you mean. So you can
Yeah.
retrieve your ticket that you've
Yeah.
ordered online, that type of thing, like the systems here do. But that, let's assume that it's meant to be more limited functionality than that. To me, there's a really big thing missing from it. I've got kids. I usually travel with my kids. I don't want to buy one ticket at a time. Okay? I want the option to, or even if I'm traveling in a group of people, to say I want 5 adult tickets, rather than each one of us take the time to purchase individually. Okay? So there's nothing there to allow for that. Or there might be cases, particularly with the UK rail system, when I want to buy multiple tickets to different destinations. So I might want to travel from Sheffield to Doncaster and then Doncaster to York, rather than from Sheffield to York, because sometimes you get cheaper tickets that way, because it's just stupid. And so I might want to be able to buy a ticket not from my current destination. Okay, so can I do that? At the moment, the way it's described, I'm only going to be buying tickets from here to some other destination.
Yeah.
What about if the person has a real card?
Yeah, I guess that would come under type of ticket required. There'd be an opportunity to apply concessionary and rail cards there. So question, somebody up the back of the hand?
Was the same.
The same one, okay. Yeah, I think that, you know, so you can sort of see that there's kind of like, this is a first pass at a description of the system, but there are some holes in it. In terms of thinking about the way that users would typically use this system, there are like, you know, so what happens if I make a mistake and I want to cancel? Okay. Can I go back one step rather than starting the transaction all over again? Or do I have to start from scratch? I want to be able to buy for multiple people at a time, and I might want to be able to buy for multiple different destinations and start points. Different dates, not just current travel, that sort of thing. Okay, next question. So, suggest how an engineer responsible for drawing up a system requirement specification might keep track of the relationships between functional and non-functional requirements. So we had an example early on in the lecture of a functional requirement of the mental care system and a whole lot of related non-functional requirements. How do you keep track of all those interactions between the different requirements?
What's the meaning of keep track of the relationships?
Okay, so if I just go back. Okay, so we had this one was a user requirement or a functional requirement, where it says something that you want to do. And then we've got some other things which are also in some cases functional requirements, but they're kind of related. You can see a relationship between them. So that the mental care system shall generate monthly management reports showing the cost prescribed by each clinic during the month, we have to have a thing which will get a summary of the drugs, their costs, and the prescribing clinics. We have to generate the report at a certain time. We have to do it for each clinic. If the drugs are available in different dose units, and so on. So these are all, in a sense, that these system requirements are still functional requirements, but you might have a non-functional requirement about the time it takes to generate reports. Right? You might have a non-functional requirement about the classes of users that are allowed to access these reports. There might be sensitive information in it. You, I don't know, can anybody else think of any other non-functional requirements that you might have here? It might be about the way that the format of the report is presented. You know, you might have regulatory bodies who require you to produce this information. It has to be in a particular format. So that's a non-functional requirement, right? So, but they're all sort of related to these sets of functional requirements, right? And if we change one of those non-functional requirements, is it going to impact upon these functional requirements that we have here? Okay, so if we say the report has to be generated within 60 minutes of the creation, the initiation of the report, then there might be a related functional requirement where the users this is on the last working day, so on the first working day of the month, there might be a set of users who require that information to do certain tasks, which are listed as separate functional requirements. Right? If you change that time that it takes to generate the report from 60 minutes to 5 days, that would impact upon all those things that are meant to happen on the first of the month. Right? So you need to then keep track of how that non-functional requirement is going to impact upon other functional requirements in the system.
So it means if one requirement is changed, others are usually related, so they will change.
Yeah, very, very often. Well, particularly the non-functional requirements will impact upon functional requirements. So performance type, yeah.
Do they take precedence?
Do they take precedence? They don't necessarily take precedence. Sometimes they will, but it's going to be case-by-case type thing.
Okay.
That's why you need to keep track of the links, because you need to say, okay, we're going to change this requirement and it's going to impact upon all those other requirements there. Is that change going to make those things impossible to achieve? If it's going to make them impossible to achieve, is that a problem? Can we change those things as well to change the way that those requirements are specified? but you need to know what those links are in order to keep track of that.
Maybe by linking regular validation for changes.
Yeah, so it should be part of the validation process to do these checks, but in order to make that validation efficient, you need to keep track of them. And really, how you keep track of them, it's kind of up to you. It's kind of, the point is you need to keep track of them, but, where am I? Back to the slide I wanted, and now I've lost one wrong there. The easiest way to do it is to explicitly write down the relationships. So put down dependencies between requirements. Yeah. So in some way, you might have all your requirements listed in terms of functional requirement 1, functional requirement 2, functional requirement, and then non-functional requirement 1, non-functional requirement 2, non-functional requirement 3. And then for each non-functional requirement, you list impacts on F1, F5, F7, and so on. And you're very explicit about which ones need to be checked if you change this non-functional requirement. And back the other way around in your functional requirements, you need to say dependent on. And so you change this functional requirement, you check that dependency and make sure that it's achievable given that dependency. Okay, so that's a sort of like a hard-coded way of doing it, where you just write it down. You could have it in a relational database if you were really sophisticated, where you link things in a table and that type of thing. It kind of depends upon how formal you want it to be. Yeah?
Could UML use to show this dependency or reflect the changes in the system?
You could
UML.
use UML, yes.
Yeah.
So UML can be used for this sort of things, and it can be quite useful because it does show relationships between things. As I said earlier, it's not so commonly used in the specification stage of it, because it's usually talking about a more detailed design. In the specification stage, we want looking at what rather than how. Okay? Yeah?
Yes, I want to understand more clear about the track. For example, a non-functional requirements, maybe the SIF of the software system. It is a non-functional.
Sorry, which?
The SIF.
Safety.
Yeah.
Safety, yeah.
Yeah. The safety is a non-functional requirements of the system.
Yes.
So keep the track of the relationship between the functional and non-functional requirements. It means when I want to achieve a functional requirements, I will consider it will be safe to the softwares.
Yeah, so safety is going to be, for a lot of systems, there is going to be some sort of non-functional requirements in terms of safety or security, right? So when you change your requirements in terms of safety, so for example, if you make the security tighter, say you, instead of just using a password to log into the system, you insist that all users have two-factor authentication. So they have to have something like a mobile device if they want to log into the system. That's going to preclude some users of your system, because not everybody is going to have a mobile device. So you have to look from a functional point of view. Are you locking out users who you were expecting to be able to use your, like if you want school children to use your system, some of them have mobile phones, but not all of them, right? So if we put in that security requirement, is there some functionality of the system that's going to be impacted? And so we need to look at those links between things. Okay? Okay. last question for today. It's just going for 3 today because they're quite long ones. So, when we have to make emergency changes to a system, so for example, we find a security flaw and it has to be updated now, how do we keep track of those changes to the system so that if we've got a formal requirement specification, the document doesn't become out of sync?
You could use like some sort of document management system, something like ClearCase, or where basically like the documents, you know, like it's locked into a system, so when it gets updated, that you have to unlock it and then update it, and it goes back in, so all the users are aware of it's being changed.
Yeah. So the important thing is that if you make changes, even if they are an emergency one, it needs to go into that requirement specification. And yeah, one way of ensuring it happens is you have a formal process where you have documents that get locked, and then you unlock it to make the changes and then relock it. Before you even put it into the document though, you need to go through the process. Okay, so we've made some emergency changes. I fixed the security concern. What else needs to happen? So we've put out the fire, so to speak. The critical thing has been addressed. What else needs to happen? Recover, yeah. So particularly if data has been lost or something, you need to restore from backup and that type of thing. What else? In terms of the software engineering process.
Record and find out the reason.
Not quite on the right track there.
You need to document what you have done.
Document what you've done, and what else? Sorry?
Test the system.
Test the system, but not just test the system. What else do you need to check? It's related to the previous question. You need to do the validation again. Okay, so you've made a change by implementing this patch to your system to fix some critical problem. You need to check that that hasn't affected any of the other requirements. So you need to go through that requirements validation process. And if it's broken, some of the other requirements, you need to address them as well, right? And get a new, consistent, coherent, validated set of requirements. And that gets updated in the document and put into your locked document system. Okay? So you don't just make the change and put it into the requirement specification, because you might be introducing something that's not consistent or that type of thing. Okay? So, yeah, by all means, patch the critical part of the system and get that deployed, but be aware that it might break, your patch might break other parts of the system. You need to be careful about it. So you need to go back and do that whole check again. Okay, and we've seen examples of it in the past year where banking systems have done things like this. Right? Where people have been locked out of bank accounts because they've applied some security patch and not looked at the impact on other parts of the system. We've seen lots of different types of things where, particularly to do with security, people go, we've got to deal with this, and they deal with that and not look at the larger implications. Okay, so there isn't one answer to how you do this, right? But essentially the idea is that when you do requirements change, there are two paths. There's the standard path where you go through the full formal process that we've been talking about here, where you do the elicitation, you do the analysis, you do the specification, you do the validation, and then you've got your updated document, and then you do the implementation. And then there's the critical path, where we have a problem and we have to deal with it straight away. We deal with that problem, and then we check that that hasn't had any other implications and update the requirement specification accordingly. But in both paths, the requirement specification gets updated. That's the most critical thing. Okay? So they're the 3 questions, and I will put the updated version of these slides on the web so that you've got the 3 questions if you want to look at them again. For next Monday, you should have all got feedback from the first week on Friday. Is there anyone who hasn't worked out how to get their feedback in MOL? I did notice that a lot of people did it straight away at 3 o'clock on Friday. I saw people go, because I could see when people access things, so I saw that some people were looking at it. But do make sure that you check your feedback. I'll have this week's up by 3 o'clock this coming Friday. You should all have access to MOL now, so please submit it via MOL rather than